I apologise if you have been to the talk previously that I did for the West Cumbria group. I've given it the same title because I just love this quote about the view in the past of North Cumbria particularly. My work comes out of my PhD research, which I completed just over 10 years ago now. But my interest in historic landscapes goes back decades. I've been an archaeologist for well over 40 years. Kind of retired from archaeology, but I still do talks like this to local groups and things. I've been a landscape archaeologist for a long time, and I got into GIS mapping also quite a long time ago now. I did the Cumbria historic landscape characterisation for the Lake District and the wider county, if any of you have ever seen that. And that kind of piqued my interest because although that was looking at contemporary and the 19th century OS maps to look at the historic character that you can see in today's landscape, it was a strategic planning tool rather than an analytical tool to understand the landscape. A lot of archaeologists don't understand that and kind of don't really know how to use the data. But it made me think that HLC, for short, is quite a useful technique to try and understand past landscapes. And I think there is quite a perception that I'll use Cumbria, even though we're now Cumberland and Westmoreland and all that, split up again. I'll use Cumbria as a shorthand. There's a view that it's very much a landscape where you can see the past, the medieval and early post-medieval past, and I wanted to examine that. So I took the techniques that I'd used for this project, but used older estate maps and 18th century and earlier maps to try and see what it could tell us about the medieval landscape ultimately. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So it's going to be very much broad brushing across the county, but I'm going to try and give it a slant to this area, okay, to show you what I found out about this area. Next slide, please. I have a remote slide changer sitting over there. Right, okay, so this was the area I looked at. I didn't look at the entire post-1973 county of Cumbria. I cut out the little bit of Yorkshire that came into Cumbria because it's quite different. So really I use the historic counties of Cumberland and Westmoreland plus Lancashire over Sands. And there is actually a reason for using that. It has got some historicity. It is a robust area to use. These areas were known as the Lake Counties going back hundreds of years, and the term Cumbria is not a modern term. It goes back quite a few hundred years. So I thought that made quite a good cohesive area. Next slide, please. So, my quote comes from Daniel Defoe, and he wrote this coming over from, I think, County Durham, over the Pennines and into Cumbria, into the Westmoreland bit of Cumbria. Yes, the wildest, most barren and frightful. Also, there's a description from 1570 talking about how the people in North Cumbria, in Cumberland, are really very tough people. And it gives the impression, and that is an impression that we still have today, I think, that Cumbria is some kind of wild, almost uninhabited place. And one of the things I want to get across in this talk is that this has really influenced government policies. We're seen as out there on the edge. Not much is going on up here. They can cover us in forestry, doesn't matter, there's not much going on. It really does affect the way our countryside and environmental policies affect the landscape around us. I don't feel that I live in that wild and barren a place, and I live right up on the border with Scotland. We are our own community, if you like. We have our own cohesiveness. I know I'm not Cumbria by birth. You know, I've lived up here for quite a long time. But you don't feel like you're out on the edge of things, even if you live in a wild and fairly remote place, I suppose. But the view that you get in records is that we're kind of out there and wild and barren and not a lot going on other than the honeypots of the Lake District. So that's something else I really wanted to address. Can I have the next slide, please? So, because you can see I pulled this off the web. I have other pictures, so I thought I'd try and find something local. Yes, there's not a lot of houses here, but I don't think this is barren and frightful. I know it's a lovely day, but there's nice trees around. There's a view that there's no trees up here other than the forestry plantations. Clearly it's not. It's not a heavily populated area. And this is, I think this is going up to Garrigill, isn't it? I think, from what I remember. But it's lovely. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. Next, please. Next slide. And we have a really diverse landscape. These pictures really just come from around the county. Just to show you, we have what was a heavily arable area on the Solway Plain at the bottom left there, and we have the fells, and then we have places like the Lyme Valley, which just beautiful, their own little microcosm of dams and orchards. And indeed, where I live in the Kingwater Valley. It's a beautiful little valley, not well populated, but it's really pretty compared to the views that I live somewhere, you know, north of the Wall. There go the White Walkers, for those of you who know Game of Thrones. But, you know, it's not when you're there. You don't feel like it is. Next slide, please. And of course, a lot of this variety of landscape comes from the complex geology. I'm not going to go into this. Next slide again, please. Next one. That's it. Which leads to this, you know, huge variations in landscape across quite small distances, really. The Lake District is the most complex bit. There's a lot of different geological formations going on. The nice orange bit going up the Pennines there and across the Solway Plain. And these are the areas, of course, where we do get a lot of the mineral wealth of Cumbria. So coal and lead and so on. And a little bit of it going down the west coast. Those are our coal fields particularly. Right, next slide, please. So, right, how do I go about picking apart the landscape to understand why our landscape looks the way it does today? We still have quite a lot of unenclosed land. So, obviously the big blob in the middle there, I've used the moorland line here to give a rough idea of the areas that are unenclosed. So that area in the centre are the Lakeland Fells, obviously, and then up the eastern side you've got the Pennines. But how much of this was unenclosed in the past? Are we looking at a remnant of the unenclosed moorlands and fells? How much have we lost? How much has been enclosed since the post-medieval period? Next one, please. One way I could start to do this is to look at our maps. I will come back to this map. Okay, this is one of my favourite maps. So, what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk backwards. I'm going to look at the post-medieval landscape and then go back to the medieval landscape to show you the methods I use. Really, it's a form of map regression. So what I'd used in the past were modern maps and 19th century Ordnance Survey maps, but I needed sets of maps that I could use consistently across the county. There's lots of beautiful very late medieval and early post-medieval maps scattered around the country, and I used those where I could, but I needed consistent sources to try and look at the 18th century landscape. Next slide, please. And the obvious sources for that, There were two. One were the late 18th century county maps, so Donald for Cumberland, Jeffreys for Westmoreland, and Jeffrey again for Lancashire. Now, although they're county scale and they don't show individual fields, what they do show, excuse me walking across the map, these areas here are unenclosed lands. And although I didn't actually digitise them and put them onto my computer screen to overlay the later maps, you can trace those boundaries in the landscape. They're really easy to trace. You've also got settlement and woodland on there as well, and in some cases you can actually work out where common arable fields still survived in the late 18th century. So I mapped all those, and in addition to that I used the enclosure maps. Now, not every parish, not every area had enclosure maps, but there was enough across the county to be a good source to give me a good idea. So I could plot those, you could trace those in modern field boundaries as well. I looked at well over 200 enclosure maps across my survey area. They got to know me very well in all the archive offices across the county. Okay, next slide please. So this is what I ended up with. The map on the right is what we have today. The map on the left shows you what it was like by the late 18th century. There are some slightly darker grey areas. Those were areas that were unenclosed slightly before the county maps of the late 18th century. So it gives you an idea of what it was like earlier in the 18th century, if you like. So about half the whole area was unenclosed. So there's quite a difference between, I think it's something like a third or so now. So it is quite a lot more land how it was unenclosed by the late 18th century. Now, I know there's a lot else that's going on around it, but that gives us a good baseline to look at the rest of it. Next slide, please. But to look at it, sorry, next one again. That's it. These are some of the maps that were slightly earlier enclosed ones. Here on West Cumbria, you can see an excerpt from one of those maps there and how I actually drew them out onto the modern maps. And you can see this here is in this area here. You can actually see the boundaries quite clearly on the modern map. So they were easy to map. Next slide, please. So they weren't, all the enclosure maps weren't sort of moorland and fell. So those ones on the west coast were low-lying moorland. But we also have things like occasional maps of enclosures of outfields. So these are occasionally ploughed lands. So you have an infield which are ploughed and used for arable and growing crops every year. And here in Espatria you also have an outfield, so it might be ploughed, say, once every 10 years. Used for common grazing in between, but then every so often they will plough it and use it for crops to refresh the land and give them a bit more sort of growing area. And this was Espatria's outfield. There's a whole series of infield-outfield systems along the Solway Plain, actually. Something I only started really looking at, touching the edges of. It needs a more detailed survey really to pick the whole thing out. Next, please. So, breaking it down by the historic counties, you can see that the most unenclosed county in the mid to late 18th century was Westmoreland, somewhere that seems really quite well populated today. But in the past, perhaps may give an indication while Daniel Defoe turned round and said, oh, the most barren and frightful place, because it would have had a lot more unenclosed, seemingly wild land for common grazing in the 17th century. Lancashire over Sand's the most enclosed, and I'm not really going to touch on this later. I'm going to look at monastic influences later, but I'm not really going to talk about Furness Abbey. But I think the influence of Furness and Cartmel abbeys that owned a lot of this land in the medieval period is the reason why so much of it is enclosed by the mid-18th century, because it was quite intensively used by the abbeys. Quite strong religious lordship. And then we have Cumbria there with almost half the area unenclosed, and that's because it's got quite a lot of the Lake District fells, the Pennines, but also a lot of wetland moorland along the Solway Plain too. There's various reasons for it. Okay, next please. So that's the baseline. Next thing I did was plot settlement, and I had to do dots on the map. I couldn't actually draw the outlines of settlements because it'd just be one big splodge on a map. You can see it's quite well populated, so nearly 5,500 separate settlements. So there's individual farmsteads and small hamlets, say 3 to 5 houses, and towns and villages across the area. That's by the late 18th century. Next slide, please. But out of those, I could actually distinguish quite a few, shown on this map, that came into existence in the post-medieval period. So they were there after 1700. So that represents settlement expansion. Looks quite a lot, but next please. Oh, no, sorry, if you could go back a bit, I'll come back to this one. That's okay. It's worth looking at that. You're still left with a lot of settlement that predates 1800, starting to give you an idea of what the medieval settlement pattern might have been. And I'm going to come back to that later on. If you could go back to that map, please, that'd be great. That's it, thanks. So, this is, have any of you seen this map before?
No.
Right, yes, one or two. This is, it's actually in the National Archives at Kew. I spent a happy week exploring maps in the archives, and I found a pair of maps, this one, and I'll show you the next one in a moment, of Alston Moor. So this shows you the settlement pattern in the late 18th century. And you have this Garrigill in here. Shows you, although there's a little nucleation, it's very small at that time, but most of the settlement are individual farmsteads. And this is what I'm sure you're all familiar with, the minor farmer landscape concept. Of individual farms scattered along the valleys, and the farmers also mining. So, you know, they're not just pure farmers, they're not just pure miners, they're doing a bit of both. This isn't unique to this area. You've got the same in the Lake District. Most farmers in the Lake District had some form of by-employment. So they were mining, or perhaps they were making potash, a whole range of other jobs, little industrial jobs. Farming in particularly the upland areas of Cumbria was never something that was going to just support a family. If you got enough money to be what they call a statesman in the Lake District, you might be trading cattle on a larger scale, but most of them were involved in other jobs and made their money and their fortunes this way. Next slide, please. Should be another one comes up. Oh, right, okay. This is the one that's on the title slide. This map goes with the other one. This is a kind of close-up of Garrigill and the farms around it. And I could plot some of these still. They're still there on modern maps, okay? So even if farmsteads are rebuilt at a later period, the sites of the steadings go back. There's quite a lot of groves, as they call them on here, mine shafts, adits, marked on this map. And the previous map you can see where there are veins. So clearly you can see how the landscape develops in this area, even though they're not showing what you think are lots of detail. Okay, next one, please. Okay, so really once I've mapped the settlement, the unenclosed land, everything else, other than small areas of woodland that I mapped, everything else was enclosed land by the late 18th century. So it's quite a simple map. What I then did was I divided the county up into what I call character areas. So these are areas with similar characteristics. So there were, how many of them? 22 altogether. Number 9 is here, it's Alston Moor, 8 is the Pennines, and then 7 is the Eden Valley. If you go to the next one, please, I think I've got some illustrations. Oh, I didn't know I'd made the transitions look like that. So the Pennines, that's really boring, isn't it? The Pennines, unenclosed, basically. A few of the darker grey bits are later intakes, but they're still post-medieval in date. Next one, I think, should show you. Yep, this area, again, it's quite simple. You've got a whole rash of farmsteads, hamlets, and nucleations like Alston scattered along the valleys, along the South Tyne and the Nent valleys. And everything else was enclosed until you get up onto the fell. What it doesn't show you is the mining landscape. That's not really what I was trying to show. It was trying to look at the landscape across the county. So in some ways, I suppose you could say this looks a bit disappointing for this area. It looks essentially quite simple, but I think the story, and as we go back into the medieval period, of how this develops to look like this is quite interesting. Okay, next please. I'll just compare it to the Eden Valley, which is, oh, I seem to have lost the top of that slide, I'm sorry. But you can see there's quite a difference. So the red areas are common arable fields that still survive into the 18th century. You've got a lot more bigger dots on there, which are villages and towns. You've got the solid green areas on there are deer parks, so you've still got quite a lot of those. You've still got an enclosed land, but those are the common pastures between the enclosed fields belonging to individual farms and the common arable fields. So it's quite a busy looking character area certainly compared to the Pennines, but compared to Alston Moor as well. And that just kind of shows you the difference between different types of character areas. Okay, next please. Right, this is taken from the Historic England survey by Matt Oakey and colleagues on this area, looking at the mining remains, the post-medieval mining activity or industrial activity. And this really gives you much more detail. This goes quite well with my settlement map, and it's quite detailed. And I'm sure you are much more familiar than I am with all the industrial activity that's going on here. But if you put the two together, it makes quite an interesting contrast. And how much was happening in the post-medieval period. Okay, we'll move on from that, I think. Okay, so how did I get from there to the medieval landscape? Now, my post-medieval landscape, I didn't show you the overall mapping like this because it's very difficult to make out at a county scale. You need to zoom into those character areas. For the medieval period, you'll notice there are white areas. And that's because, to go back further, I'm relying on data that is less comprehensive across the county. So I'm starting to use more of those estate maps that you only get here and there. But there's various other data sources that I could rely on as well. So there are holes in the data. I could probably, if I went to look at it, account for a lot of those holes. Some of it would be extra unenclosed land that I don't have any proof when it was enclosed. Some of it was probably enclosed fields relating to farms, but they're not necessarily visible in any maps that I could find, or even on 19th and 20th century maps, where often you can see coherent blocks of land belonging to farms, but it's not everywhere, so they're not always mapped. I'm going to look at some of the details on this map and the forces that kind of lay behind the way the landscape developed. Okay, so here you've got arable fields, parks, woodland and settlement. I'm going to talk about these different aspects and how they formed. Next, please. Right, so starting with settlement, this is a subset of the late 18th century one, and I used the place name volumes, so Mare and others for Cumberland. Really good resources. Because they're older place name volumes, they have a lot of historical details, and quite often it'll give you the first documented instance that a place name occurs. So from that, it's not perfect, and there are areas that I know they don't have early dates, and I could show something as being earlier from other sources, but it gives you a pretty good idea. So what I was interested here is the settlement patterns across the county. So you've got an awful lot, the red dots are towns and villages. So you've got a whole load going up the Eden Valley, around the Solway Plain and down the west coast, and then down in the kind of Furness area at the bottom there. And there are obvious gaps in that as well, particularly up on the border in the area I live now, where you've got hamlets and individual farms. Still 2,500 separate settlements, so it's quite a lot. In fact, there were probably more than that, because it doesn't really account for shrinkage that we can't demonstrate was there. Okay, next please. Okay, to go with the nucleated settlement, particularly the villages and towns, I mapped the arable fields. Now I showed those that still survived in the 18th century. There was quite a lot more in the late medieval period, and I had to use other people's studies, particularly Dilly and Elliott, who'd done a lot of work in Cumberland particularly on arable fields, but also the Reverend Graham, who worked in the early part of the 20th century up in the barony of Gilsland. And the patterns are obvious. Where the nucleated settlement is, we have most of the common arable fields. So you've got more population, they're farming, they're arable farming in quite big arable fields in the lower lands, so along the Solway coast, down the Eden Valley and down in the Furness Peninsula as well. Few maps, but where I did get some maps, they were really valuable. And you can still see, so places in the Eden Valley here like Great Asby and Crosby Garrett, you can still see in these field patterns here, you've got the long, sinuous strip fields. Clear sign where you once had common arable fields. Slightly different on the Solway Plain. A lot of those strip fields are very straight and relate to enclosure of wetlands. But you also have some of these surviving as well. Okay, next please. Some of the maps I do have, and this is one I showed earlier. I love this map. This is part of the barony of Gilsland survey from 1603. Absolutely beautiful map. It's one of the best surviving of that. There's, I think, 13 different maps of each of the townships and parishes in the barony of Gilsland. This is one of the best preserved, because unfortunately all the maps were sunk in a shipwreck when they were being transferred from Naworth Castle down to Castle Howard. They sunk in the Humber, I think, and ended up in the the Palace Green Library in Durham University for a long time. They're now back in Cumbria. They've all been digitised and you can look at them as digital images in the archives in Carlisle. Like I say, this is one of the best preserved of Torquay. Okay, next one please. I think which is just, a close-up, and it's so good because it actually shows you how the landscape was changing. Now I put the end of the medieval period for Cumbria at about 1600, right? Never mind 1485 and what you learn in school. The consensus now is probably the dissolution is more of a better date for the end of the medieval period in most places. But up here, I quite like taking about 1600 as the end of the medieval period when you've got the settlement of the borders. So you've got the crown, James becomes king of Scotland and England, the borders are pacified, and I think that makes quite a good end to the medieval period here. And it's after this time when you get the big changes in the landscape. But here in Torquay, you can see in 1603, you've still got a common arable field. It's in the process of changing. This is how piecemeal enclosure worked. So you've still got common fields here, strip fields. Can you see that they're dotted lines? So these are open fields with unfenced strips. Down here, you've still got the common field, but they've been enclosed, you've got solid lines, and in many places they've been consolidated. So Thomas Milburn, which is the name on here, has got possession of these fields. He's obviously swapped with people to get bigger blocks of land and has enclosed them all to be one. He will have had permission and he will have paid a fine to take possession of big blocks of land which he can then fence for his own use. And that's how piecemeal enclosure works, because it's more convenient for them to farm in one big block rather than having individual strips spread across the common field. I won't go into why all that happened. It's many and varied reasons. So you've got history in action here, if you like, change in action. But it's absolutely beautiful example, and it's really rare to see something like this. Okay, next please. And the best thing about it, this is me mapping the common field as I saw it in the late medieval period. I could have actually put more in if I wanted to, but I kept it fairly simple. The blue areas are individual farm holdings. So these are people who held their farms by lease, so they had more rights to them. The villagers in here would have held strips in the common field. These people may also have had some strips in the common field, but they had their own big blocks of land as well around their farms. And indeed, Netherton, which is this one, was the demesne farm. That was the manor farm. So that was the manor's own demesne holding. You see, it was quite a big farm. There are 2 farms in here. Okay. But the best thing about this map, if you go to the next one, please, is we can actually, I think you might have to press next again, how good the surveyor in 1603 was.
Wow. Cool.
That is so accurate. We think these maps are, they didn't have surveyors' chains properly, or, they didn't have modern survey methods, but just how good they are. Okay, next please. It's a shame all the other maps aren't as well preserved. Just to give you a quick example of 1578 maps, these are all in the National Archives in Kew. This is Sadgill in Long Saddle. This again is how the landscape is changing at the end of the medieval period. Do you all know Sadgill and Long Saddle? I think it's one of the nicest valleys to walk because it's one of the less touristy ones. Yeah. This map is right at the head of the Long Saddle Valley. So you've got the settlement here, which is the farmsteads scattered all along the valleys, and then you've got the head dyke here and the fell beyond. Now if you walk up there and go through the head dyke today, there's an area of woodland and there's a farm in here called Low Sad Gill. These three maps were drawn up by different parties in a dispute, which is clearly about the enclosure of this area and the building of a farmstead in there. So it's taking land out of common grazing and privatising it basically. But we have a bit of woodland that is still there today that is medieval in origin. Next one please. And there we go. This is a close-up of the middle one. We can actually identify these farms. So although they've got the tenants' names, you can actually identify them on modern maps. This is the woodland here. No farm on there in 1578. Next one, please. Right, this is my plotting of it, and these are the farms I could identify. We have Stockdale there. This is the area of woodland, so the head dyke goes across here. You've got that woodland. We have a farm on there. Next one, please. This is Low Stockdale Farm. It's listed grade 1, and it is, no, it's not listed grade 1, it's listed grade 2, which is appalling really. It should be more than that. It's got 18th century extensions, but it is down as being late 16th or early 17th century. Well, I think if those maps are anything to go by, 1578, we can probably say that it is late 16th century and was built soon after this dispute was settled. So it goes on my map as a medieval farm, even though it was right at the end of the period. It was for sale a few years ago. You can still get the sales details up online in an archived PDF, and it's absolutely fantastic inside, really beautiful. But here we go, settlement creation in action. Next, please. Right, so what does this, I mean, it's nice to pick out individual examples, but I was interested in patterns. And you can see patterns in the splodges on the map on the left there, but I thought I'll do a little bit of statistics with it. And I looked at densities of settlement as well to see what that would tell me. And obviously the densest settlement, in some ways this is fairly obvious, it relates to the best land. So the Eden Valley, the Solway Plain and down the west coast. But also along the coastal margins down here as well. Though in the post-medieval period, I know we've got roads that go along there now, but in the post-medieval period, you didn't travel by land to this bit, you travelled across Morecambe Bay. It was actually really quite wild and difficult to get at down here. And your main route was from Lancashire over Sands, going to Lancashire over Sands was from the Arnside Silverdale area, as you do today if you go with the guide, going across the sands, whether in a cart or on foot. That's why there's hundreds of lost vehicles and drowned people and all sorts of records of disasters across the bay. It was safer than going overland, which seems strange today, yet this was still quite a well-settled area. And that's the influence probably of the monasteries in the medieval period. Next, please. I actually looked, out of that I did a subset looking at just what I call dispersed settlements, so individual farms and hamlets. And it does give a different pattern. So, if I can explain this, the biggest density of individual farms, so where you have more individual farms rather than nucleated settlements, where you might expect, so up there on the Scottish border, this area here, but also not so much down the Eden Valley, but across the Solway Plain and down the west coast. The top end of the Eden, right at the top end of the Eden Valley, you have some. And this was strange. And I'd like to do some work on this in many ways, because I think what you've got in these areas where you also have a lot of towns and villages down the west coast and the very top end of the Eden Valley, I think you've got hints of the pre-conquest landscape showing through, where you have a more dispersed landscape of farmsteads and hamlets. And they survive and they're overlaid by planned villages at a later date. Not so much in the Eden Valley proper down here, where you seem to have a reorganisation of the landscape into a more planned village settlement pattern. But down that west coast, where you have early forms of place names, places like Hensingham, Ingerham, Ingerton, they're earlyish place names, and I think you've got an earlier Anglian settlement pattern just kind of peeking through, but for which we have very, very little archaeological evidence. Although it's interesting that we've got that, what they call a Viking Age hall that's come up recently near the site of the Solfest fields, near Espatria. But you've got the same up here as well, and right at the upper end of the Eden Valley. So it's something that would warrant more work, really. And I just wanted to pull out this area, which is Stainmore, and I'll come back to this in a little bit. Here you've got, you could say, oh, well, it's just scattered settlements because we're up on the Pennine edge. But this isn't just scattered settlement because it's in the uplands. It's a deliberate decision by the lords who oversaw this area. I'm going to talk about forests in a minute. These were vaccaries or cattle farms. And I think I'll go on to that. If you can, next one, please. So, the reason for the establishment of things like vaccaries is because a lot of Cumbria was forested, by which I do not mean covered in trees, right? It means they were subject to forest law. And if you look at all these areas in blue, and there's 27 of them, I think, an awful lot of the county was brought under forest law. And the reason for that is it's a marcher county, it's a border county with Scotland, so the lords who ruled over this area were given a huge amount of power. They were fairly autonomous, beg your pardon, and they were given permission to forest areas, bring them under forest law, which ostensibly is for hunting, but in fact means they've got rights to do all sorts of different things in those areas and restrict what the tenants, the peasantry, could do under them. If you move on, please. The most famous one is Inglewood, right in the middle there. It's one of the biggest, and unusually for Cumberland, and by its name, it was well wooded. Okay, and it really was somewhere that was dedicated to hunting. It was a nice landscape, it was good landscape, more lowland. There was a lot of woodland there, and there's still a lot of forest woodland names, places like Briscoe, that indicate there had been a lot of trees there in the past. Although it's much less wooded today, because it was also quite good arable land. That woodland certainly seems to have been there in the Roman period, and evidence from Carlisle from the Millennium Project was done where they found timbers and dated them. They think they probably came from Inglewood Forest. Now, there's some idea that it may not have survived the Roman period but came back on later on in the early medieval period. But by the conquest period, it was a well-wooded area again. It was renowned for producing timber, which was all very well controlled. Okay, next one please. I'm going to compare this with 13 on that map, which is Gilderdale Forest, which is a bit of an enigma. I've drawn it. It's this blue line around the outside here. I've drawn it to coincide with the boundaries of Ulston parish, the manor of Ulston, which seems to make most sense, but we don't actually have the bounds written down. It was quite a large area, 149 square kilometres. The prime purpose of this forest was not hunting, it was the mineral wealth. So primarily silver, but also lead. And the rights were granted, various protected rights were granted to the miners from the 13th century onwards. Next one, please. And the reason for it was the burgesses of Carlisle were granted the farm, which is the profits from the rents from the forest, from the mines, and they were used to produce silver to go to the mint for coinage in Carlisle. The Carlisle Mint didn't stopped making coins in the, I'm trying to remember the date now, but I think it had stopped kind of in the 13th century. But it was being worked and producing coins from the 12th century. And here we've got some 12th century coins here. So the forest was incredibly important for producing silver to supply to the mint in Carlisle. And you've got to remember how important Carlisle was as a centre at this time, as a kind of fortress controlling what was going on with the Scottish border. Sometimes it was actually, in the 12th century, it came under Scotland as well, when it was reoccupied by the Scots for a time. Okay, and here we've got the heart of why Ulston, the Ulston area, looks the way it does. Developed because of the mines, which were important for lead and silver particularly. Next one, please. Okay, so I will come back a little bit to that later, looking at the landscape of this area. But one of the other things I plotted alongside the forests themselves were things like deer parks. Deer parks are deer preserves, if you like, at their most simple. And there are a lot of them scattered both within the forest and outside the forest. There are a few forests in Westmoreland in comparison to Cumberland, but there are a lot of deer parks. It's quite a hunting landscape in Westmoreland. But within Cumberland, where your forests were much more widespread, and not all these forests were operating at one time, I have to say that, but you've still got deer preserves within them. So the forests were subject to forest laws, but the hunting would have been concentrated around the areas of parks. And I've just given you an example here of what a park boundary might have looked like. So you have a bank with an internal ditch. Okay, next please. And of course we have one in this, I'll come back to that, sorry, I'll talk about Cockermouth first. Cockermouth's quite a good example of one where you can see its boundary in the modern landscape. The existing field boundaries up there and down here, the river on one side. It's quite common to use rivers as boundaries. And it comes out of the castle down here. Next one, please. And we have a nice 18th century map, which, and again, please, and it should turn. That's it, and I'll show you how that fits over. So it fits quite well. Now, what's strange about this is that it's divided into fields. So we've got one area that looks like a deer hay at the eastern end, but the rest of it's divided into fields. These fields actually go back to the medieval period, which seems a bit strange. Next one, please. But it was divided into fields because they could make more money, not just from hunting, but by selling the rights to various produce from the fields. So they rented it out for grazing. They took wood and timber. There's a difference between wood and timber. Okay, wood is branches, tree falls, small bits of wood off trees. Timber is the trunk, the thing that you might use for building with. Okay, so they're different rights. So peasants might have the rights to collect wood, but they would have to get special permission to cut timber if they wanted to build with it. Timber was much more valuable. So yes, in the late 13th century, these fields go back to then. It was used by the manor to farm its own cattle. Then went back to being a deer park for some time, but it kept going back and forth. They could make more money out of renting these fields out, taking money for things like bark and honey, and bark of course is important for the tanning industry. So there's a lot of use for this land. It wasn't just an enclosure for deer. And I think that is one of the main things about the medieval period and land use, and comes out of looking at things like forests and deer parks. They tried to make money every which way. It was about how they could make the most out of it. Next, please. Right, this is Wanwood Park. This is what I plotted on the left here, which goes up to the county boundary and really encompasses the area that's got Wanwood names now. This is what Historic England recorded as a boundary, which is actually down here, where it says Low Park, and I think is there a High Park as well?
Yeah.
I suspect, actually, that the park came down here and it was much bigger.
Yeah.
I think this is possibly maybe just a smaller enclosure within the park that they've picked up on. But, you know, I was working at a county scale. I wasn't looking at it, and I was working quite rapidly to plot all of these. Next, please. Okay, just very quickly going back to these vaccaries, another produce, something else that came out of forests. They could make money by operating commercial cattle farms. These are two that this one at Gatesgarth in Buttermere has been excavated. So they have in-by land where they fold the cattle in the winter to manure it, and they could control the cattle, separate them out, cull cattle, sell them off, and then they would graze them up on the fells in the summer. There's only one very lowland one, which is near Cockermouth again, which actually belonged to Home Cultural Abbey. Next, please. There's just quick examples, really. And then again, going back to Stainmore, the entire settlement pattern, there's some modern maps in there, but the entire settlement pattern is based on this early pattern of vaccaries that were scattered around the head of the valley going up onto the pass. And some of them appear to have been new and carved out of unenclosed lands in the medieval period, because you get names like Thwaite, which means a clearing. We also get hegascales, and scales comes from scali, meaning seasonal settlement. It's an Anglo-Scandinavian word. So it may have started as a seasonal settlement for one of the vaccaries, but became a vaccary in its own right. It's one of these two, to be honest. I can't remember offhand without looking in more detail. But you can see, I hope, that the grey areas are unenclosed land. The brown splodges are the in-by holdings of each individual farm. But you've got outgangs here, trails coming down to the farms and in here, where they would have brought the animals in for the winter and then taken them out again in the summer. So you've got quite a nice preservation of the medieval field pattern, settlement pattern there. Okay, next please. Right, very quickly, I'm just going to look at one example. The other main influence on the development of the landscape, and I've hinted at it a bit when I've mentioned Furness Abbey down here, are the monasteries, the religious lordships. Now in Cumbria they were very powerful as many secular lordships. And I'm just going to look at home culture very quickly. Next, please. Okay, so up there on the northwest coast, it's interesting because it was actually founded by King David of Scotland when Cumberland was actually part of Scotland, or had gone back to Scotland. It was granted a lot of land, and it established granges or farms that were outside the monastic centre, across its core holdings here, but also across the county. Originally it held quite a bit of land in Scotland, but as soon as war was declared between England and Scotland, it lost its Scottish lands. So it was given special dispensation to keep being granted land in England, even after the Statute of Mortmain, which stopped that going on elsewhere because the Crown was worried about losing too much land to the church. Holmencoltron was given an exception. Okay, next please. Its central holding is around this block of coast, and there's a next again please. I think this should be a description. It's a really good description of its boundaries, and it's still really visible as boundaries in the landscape. It was quite well wooded. I think it mentions, here you are, moss and wood. Now, we might say, oh, moss, that's no good for it, but it was a hugely valuable resource. Reeds, food, so they could fish in the wet bits, take turfs, peat, reeds for thatching, so everything had a value, everything was managed. The woodland would have been managed for building either fences or houses, so everything had a value and would have been closely managed. And I think this shows one of the boundaries going across the landscape here. Next, please. It had a town, it was given a borough, Skimbernes, and it was protected, its land, which is quite low-lying, was protected by a sea dike. And this is a late 16th century map showing the sea dike. Can you see the bend there? That's there. There's the syke that goes through it there. Next, please. And of course it's still there. If you drive along that coast, you drive next to a big bank, that is the medieval sea dike that protected the lands of Holmencoltron Abbey. Next please. And this is what its landscape looked like. We'll ignore all this because this is all outside it, but the green splodgy areas is woodland, so it had a lot of woodland resources to call on. Each black dot is either a tenanted farm or a grange, so a farm operated by the monastery itself. The red areas were the arable fields, and the brown bits around each of the dots are the in-by lands, their own holdings. And then the grey areas was an enclosed moss, so it was very low-lying land. Now I'm going to look at this area, Newton-Arlosh, next please. Okay, Skimbernes was, I say it was granted as a borough, it was inundated by a storm in 1305, so they abandoned it. I know there's still a little bit of Skimbernes there, but what they did was they established a new market and port. They were granted a licence to establish a new market and port at Newton-Arlosh. Next please. There it is. It's a very tiny place now. It's basically, it was a one-row town with a bit of common arable field in red there, but it was a really important port. It never really grew much, but it was the basis for Edward's invasions into Scotland for a start, so it was quite important. And they did earn money by coastal trading as well from Newton-Arlosh. So those monks weren't going to pass up any opportunity to make some money. Basically, next one, please. And of course it's really famous for its fortified church. It's a very strange little church, if any of you have ever visited it. Its tower is like a fortified tower, and it almost looks like a manorial hall with solar tower. It looks like any kind of, from the outside, secular hall and tower. And in fact, it's not even orientated east-west like most churches. They've built a bit on the back to make it east-west now, but originally it was north-south. And I suspect originally its key thing was to be a secure place for people to go to. So yes, it's an interesting but strange little church. Okay, next please. Granges were a really important part of monastic foundations, and you can see the grey areas are all the core holdings of the monasteries, but there were granges scattered all over the county, most of them belonging to the monasteries within the county, but also, next, I think a little circle will come up. Yep, if we go into this area here and next one again, we have quite a lot of granges that are established from monasteries outside the county. And this one at Hardendale, which is off to the right of the M6 motorway at Shap, as you're going up, you can just see the little road going off to the side. Tiny little hamlet, really. It started as a burkery, so a commercial sheep farm belonging to the Cistercian Abbey of Byland, dating to the mid-3rd century. And it's still got its medieval layout effectively. Next one please. This is the village today, which is about 4 farms. And there was probably 4 farms in the medieval period, but they would have been the homes of the people working for the monks dealing with the sheep. So the sheep would have been grazed on the open fell, brought down at the end of the summer. These were the enclosed fields belonging to all the workers in the burkery, where the animals would have been folded, so they would have been brought down for shearing, for lambing, for sorting out at the end of the summer, those that were going to be culled, those that were going to be sold, those that were going to be kept. They could grow their own crops to feed themselves up here, and once the sheep were sorted out, those that were being kept would be folded onto here to graze off the stubble, and the main point of that was they would manure it for the next year. So a nice, complete system. And then come the spring, and once they'd land, they could go back out onto the fell again. And they had their own little bit of woodland as well that would have supplied them with timber and wood. And that is a really nice example. There's not many that are that well preserved, but you can still see the medieval landscape in today's maps. Okay, next please. And just quickly, Priorsdale is the only one you've got in your area, the only monastic thing. We do know that it goes back to the early 13th century and belonged to the priory at Hexham, and it was a priory because it was Augustinian, so they were canons, and they had the right. Now, I got this out of your article that was written about Priorsdale, a little in your newsletter. So the rights to cut timber in the woods of Alston for building purposes, keeping their houses and fences in repair, and all other necessary purposes. Right, timber is the big stuff, as I said before. Now it was postulated in that little newsletter article that might lead to deforestation of this area. I have to disagree, but this is something that's also stated in Sopwith as well, talking about deforestation, so denuding of woodland. The area here would never have been hugely wooded. Most of the woodland would have been in the valleys, and there really isn't very much woodland today, I have to say. But there would have been woodland, but it would have been carefully managed and preserved, so anything that was cut would have been replaced. any wood that was cut, there would have been coppicing of wood, so it would spring up again. It's quite an old idea that things like mining and other industrial uses got rid of woodland. The biggest problem with woodland, losing woodland, was the Navy wanting wood for ships. So somewhere like the Forest of Dean, there were huge arguments down there. I think it's the intensification of farming that led to the loss of woodland, by and large, not industry. It was in the interests of those working in industries to keep their woodland because they needed it for props and other uses. So, and I don't think this ever would have been that wooded. But it's an interesting little grange. Almost certainly they would have farmed sheep, but they would have had interest in mining as well. And it doesn't change much since the 19th century, but I don't have any details of what it looked like at an earlier period. And obviously this is just the stuff around it. It held land over quite a wide area originally. Okay, next, please. Okay, I'm going to race through this. Right, woodland. Having spoken about it, that's our ancient woodland today. Not a lot. Next, please. I've plotted what I could from sources of what I knew to be ancient woodland. Strangely, there's less in this area, and it's underrepresenting what there is, but I've plotted quite a lot that isn't on the recognised ancient woodland. This is the area around Home Coltram. Lots of woodland up there that we've got no evidence for. If you want to plant woodland, this is where we should be planting it, but I suspect farmers wouldn't like it very much. Next, please. And very quickly, those who've heard this before will have seen this. This is what I live just down here. This is the area, this is kind of the western extent of the Kielder Forest, it's Kershop Forest. Next, please. So all that is commercial forestry. These green areas is the ancient woodland, and it's just very restricted to gill woodland at the moment. Next, please. That's in the 19th century. So all their commercial forestry is on the moorlands, which actually would have been a huge carbon sink, more so than the awful commercial forestry, because this was permanent wet moorland, and it would have made a really good carbon sink. Next, please. But we have some maps that actually show us those areas weren't wooded, but we have a lot of woodland around the edges. Next one again, please. And if we zoom into that, you can see these are 13th century asarts, Catloudy, and some of these other settlements. So they were carved out of woodland. But these areas were wooded. And it's shrunk back to minimal areas now. Next, please. I think the next one is, yep, this is when the debatable land was settled in the middle of the 16th century. North is this way towards me. This is the border. This is all woodland down here. So next, please. So I tried plotting it. So ancient woodland, the areas where I think woodland was originally, and it's like the commercial forestry people went, where was never wooded? Let's put all our commercial forestry there and ignore the areas that had once been wooded, which is such a shame because it's actually really poisoned the landscape with acidic coniferous woodland. Hopefully it'll improve as time goes on. But when I was talking earlier about government policies, this is still happening, particularly in Northumberland, but also in these areas down here. They're trying to put more commercial forestry because nobody lives there, do they? So there you go, it's my little political point. Right, next please. Okay, so just to put it all together, this is the medieval landscape again here. And I had a go at doing character areas again. Now, I think we should have a comparison between, yeah, that's it, what I thought the character of the landscape was, so divided up into certain areas in the late 18th century and in the medieval period. There's an awful lot hasn't changed. The main changes around the Eden Valley, and this is the Forest of Inglewood, which was very wooded in the medieval period. By the post-medieval period, that has started to change because it's no longer forest and it becomes more farmed. So this is an area of change, but an awful lot of the county doesn't really change that much. It's still quite, probably character-wise, it's probably still quite medieval. Next please. And I think I've just got an example, yes. So, it doesn't look an awful lot different than it did in the post-medieval period. And you might go, oh, that's really boring. Unenclosed, some enclosed farms, scattered things along the valleys. But just to contrast with the Eden Valley had even more common arable fields in the medieval period. It was a huge concentration of rich arable land. Still some surviving in the 18th century, but even more so. And even though a lot is enclosed by the post-medieval period, you can still see the patterns of this in the landscape by the shapes of those strip fields. Here though, it may not look as excitingly different as all this arable stuff and parks and woodland and so on. But this is a product of strong lordship and strong, it's very much a product of policy to exploit this area for silver and lead. Okay, it didn't have to look like this. If they hadn't have mined things in the way they did from the medieval period onwards, there's no reason why it couldn't have had more farms and some arable fields. There probably was some arable farming, but people would have just had basically grown small fields of oats for themselves. They weren't really selling it on, they were just sustaining themselves. But here, because of the impetus to mine silver and lead, they encouraged farmers to set up along the valleys. They gave them rights and they would have given them plots to exploit themselves, to have pastoral farming, so they could pasture animals out on the fells, and develop their own little plots of land along the valleys. So this is part of a deliberate policy to manage the land in a specific way. It could have had more small villages and hamlets, still based on pastoral farming, because the land ain't great for farming. It's not the most prime arable land. But it could have had a different settlement pattern without this. And that's really important. It may not have lots of variety in it, but it really is a product of its medieval lordship patterns, if you like. So I think that's quite interesting that we have other areas that may have a similar topography but don't look quite like this. And it's very specific reasons why. Okay, next one please. Okay, this is the, if you look at it in a little bit more detail, there's quite a lot of holes in it, I'm afraid. The blue areas are the early enclosed fields, so these would have been around individual hamlets and farms. And you would have had a lot of enclosure. I didn't manage to plot any arable land in this area, partly because of the scale I was working at. But these enclosed areas would have been important because they would have been used for processing animals, processing sheep or cattle or whatever they were farming at the time. So, you know, again, shearing, lambing, carving, sorting animals out for market and all the rest of it. So relating to the fells, but also the scattered farms along the valleys where they could each have their own plots and mining areas to exploit themselves. And I think there was arable, but across the whole area, 14 acres of arable. It's not a lot, is it? And possibly that was around Alston itself, it's quite likely. 100 acres of meadow, so that was bottom land that was richer grassland, which was important for grazing animals, particularly early in the year. The 33 tenants at Garrigill had 33 shearlings, so that is an indication that they were farming sheep on the fells and they had summer dwellings, seasonal dwellings, which will only survive in archaeology. Yes, 22 tenants at Nenton Corbigates also each had their own shearlings. And then the mills at Alston itself. 3,000 acres of pasture. I think that tells you everything really. But it doesn't really talk about the mining aspects here. That underlies it, but it's there. So you can say this minor farmer landscape is something that goes well back into the medieval period. It's not just something that we see with the expansion of mining in the post-medieval period. It goes back a long way. It has its roots back in the 11th, 12th century. Sorry, the 12th, 13th century. Okay. So, right, next one, please. And I think I'm just going to finish with a final map of the medieval landscape. So, how much do we think the description of a country eminent only for being the wildest, most barren and frightful really is true? We have that as a kind of overarching statement, but there's a lot of complex history, there's a lot of different stories to be told about the county underlying it. Okay, next, and I think that's it. Thank you.
I'm sure there are actually some questions.